Hello, and thanks for joining us. I'm Shannon Sand, an agricultural economist and extension educator with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Center for Ag Profitability and one of the hosts of Ag Smart Money Week. CAP hosts regular webinars most Thursdays at noon Central Time. You can find the schedule of upcoming webinars as well as the archive of every recording on our center's website, cap.unl.edu. Today, we are excited to look at current trends in Nebraska land values, discussion of cash rents, including dry land and irrigated cropland, along with grazing and land rental rates as well as discussion on lease arrangements. To present, we are glad to be joined by Jim Jansen, a regional agricultural economist, extension educator located in the Northeast. Jim, thank you for joining us today.
All right. Well, thanks for having me today, Shannon. I'll go ahead and share my slides here. Give me one moment and we'll get switched over. All right. Well, if we're ready to go here, I'm not seeing anyone commenting that they can't hear me today. So what we'll do today is we're going along. If anyone has questions, I believe you have one or two options on your end to submit those questions. One, you can type any responses or questions into the chat pane. And there's also a feature for the question and answer. I believe Shannon Sand will be keeping an eye on things. So if I get off on something or if something's not quite right, you should probably pop on and let me know. But today's talk, we have information prepared for about 45 to 50 minutes. And then if we have any questions, we'll address those at the end, and we can even go a little past one if there would be a couple questions to answer. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I am one of the two people that annually works on the Nebraska Farm Real Estate Survey, current trends in land values, cash rents, lease arrangements, and as part of the team that also does extensive work across Nebraska on matters related to land values and cash rents, farm succession, land transition, all of these things. So if you have questions, by all means, please give me a call, text, or email, and we'll try to get you worked in when we can get to you. So with that, just one other thing I've been asked to always state, keeping in mind the information we're going to talk on are averages. They're averages. Many of them are from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Nebraska Farm Real Estate Survey, in addition to the USDA. These are simply averages, and the actual values paid for rent or for land purchases may vary depending upon the quality of the land and different forces for the area. Okay. Oops. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. A few things. The University of Nebraska has annually surveyed those people across Nebraska that work in the land industry. These include appraisers, bankers, farm managers, folks across the land industry. Each year we do two things. In the middle of March, we publish what is called the preliminary estimates. That gives us kind of a snapshot on what is happening related to land values. And for many people that are engaged in lease arrangements, cash rental rates. And then the final report comes out in June. The final report has a lot of additional information beyond what we call the preliminary estimates. Things related to land transactions. What percent of land sales in Nebraska are a cash sale, contract for deed? Who's buying land, who's selling land, things of that nature. Some of the demographics of land sales. So what we're talking on today, we're going to be taking a look at the 2023 cash rents. I encourage each and every one that is part of our conversation today to be thinking about how does your information, how does your lease, how does your cash rent, whatever it might be, how does it match up against the 2023 averages? As we enter 2024, we'll have to think about how do we kind of benchmark where we've been. If you're already on the upper end of the upper end, I don't know if you're going to see a lot of upside potential there. If you're way, way, way below the bottom average for some reason, maybe there's some other unique force guiding some of those cash rents in those areas. So as always, you can take a look at the CAP website at cap.unl.edu/real estate, or stop by your local extension office, and many of the office managers across the state can provide you with a couple pages from the report or the preliminary estimates, depending on what you're looking for. Okay. In Nebraska, we have 45 million acres of land, and with that 45 million acres of land, you can take a look at how we've subdivided the state. And some of you folks that maybe have heard of what we call crop reporting districts or agricultural statistic districts, they're highlighted up here on the screen right now. So we have northwest, north, northeast, central, east, and then the southwest, south, and southeast. Broadly speaking, these areas have similar production attributes, expectations for rainfall, yield, soil type, maybe somewhat similar stocking rates. How many cattle can you put on an acre or parcel of land? And that's why we summarize the state the way we do. About half our state is either in cropland or grazing land and hayland. That kind of sets us apart because given how heavy of a presence we have in the corn industry and related cropping industries, we still have a very robust livestock sector, especially on the cattle feeding and cow-calf pair side. So we're kind of the epicenter of the ag industry when it comes to all these different things combining and uniting in what we do here in our state. So what we'll do today, we're going to kind of start at the state level, then we'll step down to the district level, then down to the county, and then finally down to some farm examples that can be adapted to those folks that are on today's call. You can actually step them down to your farm to see what makes sense for you. All right, let's talk a little bit about land values. The purpose of today's call is not specifically on land values, but I've gotten probably 8 questions on different matters related to states and valuing of land in the last month or month and a half. A few things to point out. When we talk about the market value of something, we're always talking about a snapshot in time. And right now I'm highlighting with my mouse, hopefully you can see it, the February 1, 2023. That's when we estimate the market value of land. We'll also estimate it on February 1st, 2024. So it's always a point in time. Think of the market value as kind of like a snapshot. Think of that new car you bought, your new home or used car, doesn't matter. When you paid a certain amount of money, that was the market value at that point in time. As time goes on, maybe you improve it, maybe it depreciates, whatever the case might be. But that value does change over time. And since the outbreak of COVID and the things that happened in the economy, many assets, including land, we note that all statewide ag land values about $3,835 an acre. Over the last 2 years, the market value of land has increased about 30%. So these are some of the changes that we're seeing across the state. And I tell people that are valuing estates for farm or ranch transition purposes, we usually look at the day of or the day after someone's demise, even if it takes a couple of years for the estate matters to all get settled out. You're trying to find that point in time. So if you ever have to get an appraisal done, make sure you point out what we call the effective date, the date that you're placing the value on. You can't project it out way into the future, but they can step back in time a couple of years, a month, 2 months, or something like that. Okay. And thing to point out, Ryan Evans just shared a link to our farm real estate website. So if you want to be looking at that while you're listening, just take a look at the chat pane and you can take a look in there at the current state on where our real estate report is. So there's a few things people ask me always, what do you think is going to happen to the value of land? Well, I tell people there's 2 fundamental things that we need to look at. One, the value of what we can legally and permissibly do on the property, so raising livestock, growing crops, hay, whatever the case might be. And 2, the cost of borrowing, the cost of financing long-term debt. What do we see on this slide? Well, on the prior slide, we took that $3,800 per acre average for the all land, Nebraska all land average market value of land. And we have this in blue right here. Okay, so the last time we had an extensive drought in 2012, it peaked, came down, and then things started growing and we set a new plateau here. And there's that relationship between the value of what we're doing, so the value of corn, soybeans, crops, cattle, and the value of what we have. Without a doubt, corn prices, maybe they didn't quite hit what they did in 2012, but they got pretty darn close. And since then, they have come down. And it's not to say someone can't make money at the current commodity price levels, but things have leveled off a little bit. So for 2024, where do I think the market value is going? Well, tell me where the price of corn will be, and I'll tell you what the market value. It appears things maybe might be steady. Kind of really depends between now and February. There still can be a lot of things that might happen. And the one thing that might change is the cost of borrowing. So once again, we have the time period of 1978 on the left-hand side to 2023 on the far right-hand side, and the blue line is the Nebraska average farmland value. In the red line, we have what's called the 10-year Treasury yield rate. Now, I'm not suggesting that we are making farmland loans for 4.5%, but this is indicative, or it is kind of somewhat transparent to show us what has happened to long-term expenses, long-term interest expense. And there's different ways we route money to the ag sector for long-term ag land loans. And this 10-year Treasury yield is kind of a good benchmark to happen to take a look at. We are starting to hit interest rates that we haven't seen for a substantial period of time. And based on some of the things people have told me, it appears, the 20 to 30-year ag land loans on an annualized fixed basis, we're talking somewhere around 8%, maybe 7.5 to 8.25. But the effective interest rate, there's an inverse relationship between the cost of borrowing versus the real asset value, meaning if interest rates are low, I can afford to bid up the value of that asset. And if interest rates are high, unless price of corn and soybeans is quite good, it's really hard to offset that long-term cost borrowing. Okay. One thing to keep in mind when we go out and do these meetings, real estate taxes is a continued issue that comes in front of us as presenters, people asking questions. This is the most updated information I've been able to find so far. I assume it's probably going to be getting pushed out an update here in the next month or month and a half. If you own a home or agricultural land in Nebraska, make sure you take advantage of what we call the property tax income, state of Nebraska income tax credit for the portion of real estate taxes that goes toward your local school entity. So your local school would be K through 12. And in addition, they're starting to pick up the portion of your real estate taxes that help support the community college. This credit has grown over time. When it was first introduced to where it is now, the credit has definitely increased. So keep an outlook. We'll see what changes are made for 2024 for the 2023 year. Remember, you get your assessments in the year and they're due twice the following year. So anyways, keep an eye out on this and we'll see what the tax credit might look like when we start working on our taxes here in January of 2024. A few new things that were introduced as part of the credit during the 2023 year. And there were some subtle tweaks that were made, and I'm not for or against these. I'm just reporting on what was introduced or what changed slightly as part of this. There's a few things. One, remember when we talk about real estate taxes, broadly speaking, across the state, there's typically three big categories where real estate taxes go. There are more things, but broadly speaking, we have education. We also have local county employees, so people who work at the courthouse, county and sheriff, things of that nature. And then also local public infrastructure at the county level, which for many of the rural counties is primarily gravel roads. And with that, the biggest expense out of all three is education. So the portion of the mill levy that supports education, they have established some limits on how fast that portion of the levy, three buckets we mentioned, can go up. And also, there's a new thing that took in place, and I'll slip back here for a second. You notice from one year to the next, the real estate tax credit only went up 5%. There's now been a rule put in place how fast that can go up. So it could go up more than 5%. And also the state of Nebraska will be stepping in and has done some things for the funding of local community colleges where the state will be picking up the portion, the real estate tax that supports the community colleges. So the funding source there is slightly changed as well. And keep a keen eye out for this. Make sure you take advantage of this. There were several $100 million in our state that we're not taking advantage of as part of this tax credit in the prior year. Okay, so what we talked about so far. So far, we mentioned many of the different factors or forces that are impacting the market value of land. We briefly reviewed the state of Nebraska income tax credit that you can get if you file a tax credit in Nebraska and if you own an agricultural parcel of land, so ag land, as well as a home. Now we'll just briefly highlight some of these different things. What you'll see in these slides, and I'll share these slides with the Ag Smart Money Week folks, that these will be posted online after this call's over. You'll see that there's different types of land: irrigated, dry land, cropland, grazing land. And the thing you'll notice, and I know people calling in today are from all across the state. The thing that you'll notice is there's been pretty strong growth in the market value of land. And the same thing, especially grazing land in the last year, certain areas has seen a very strong growth rate, improvement in the market value of land. If we take a look at commodity prices, what peaked first? Corn and soybeans or cattle and swine? Well, obviously, it was more on the rural crop and small grain side, and they're still quite high. But with the cattle cycle and the cyclical nature of the livestock markets, there's definitely been higher livestock prices. And with that, there's been some additional competition to push us into some of these things that we're seeing right now for the different types of land that exclusively support, grazing land for cattle, for example. And the highest price, and this is my last comment on the market value of land, and then we'll switch gears a little bit. Some of the highest prices we've seen were for center pivot irrigated cropland, especially in the eastern portion of the state. There's been some record sales reported once again this year. Keeping in mind where are things headed in the future? Well, reflect on profitability of farming or ranching. What can you legally do on the ground? And also the interest rate affiliated with financing long-term debt expenses. Remember, just because we have higher interest rates, some of the low-risk debt, an example, if you want to put money in a CD in a bank, certain promotional offers or some of these online banks are now offering, over ordinary savings account balances of 4.5%. Even some of the CDs are exceeding 5%. So that's assuming you stay under the depository limits. That's a fairly risk-free rate of return when it comes to the level of risk affiliated with storing investments. Similar to land, land is a fairly low-risk investment as well. Okay, next thing we have here is switching gears a little bit. What is impacting land? What are things that are impacting farmland leases as well? Well, we surveyed people that take our survey. We survey them each year on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being negative, 5 being positive, and 3 being neutral or no impact. What do you estimate these different economic forces are doing to the market value of land? What we see here is it's almost like a tornado chart, meaning on the far right-hand side, if you see these lines floating on this side, we anticipate the market value line is going to be increasing. They're pointed on this side, we anticipate they're going to be declining. What do we notice? Well, for 2023, the perception of the land industry was still probably very strong. And same way with farmland leases, things were quite good. And with that, there was an anticipation that the market value of land and interest rates, or excuse me, the market value of land was quite high, rising land values, or at least steady land values, and cash rental rates.
We appeared to have lost Jim. Let's just wait a minute and see if we can get him back.
And read about it. And what are the current real estate taxes and things that are surrounding that?
Hey, Jim, can you repeat that? We lost you for a second there.
All right. Yeah, Shannon, you still hear me?
Yeah, I can now.
All right. I'm going to share my screen. Sorry about that. Okay, we should be back on. I killed my video to conserve bandwidth if that's an issue on this call. Okay, so we're talking about some of the different things related to land, different factors are impacting just not the market value of land, but also the farmland leases that we're really here to talk about today. Some of the different things related to crop prices and livestock prices are definitely guiding the market value of land higher, as well as the things that are weighing down on land or surrounding real estate taxes and property tax policies. So without a doubt, those different factors are impacting just not the market value of land, but also farmland leases and people being willing to able to bid up those things. I want to highlight farm input expenses for a little bit. And the reason I want to highlight that, we pulled this information off of DTN this past weekend for you folks. DTN has some different outlooks when it comes to some of our big inputs. Some of their things that they document are seed, or especially fertilizer. Some of the other concerns on the crop end side for 2024, without a doubt, is seed, fertilizer, and chemicals. So the question is, well, if we have to set a cash rent, we have to look at how profitable things are. What are we seeing? Well, I just took a sampling of potash as well as anhydrous prices, and a few things that we notice. Clearly, things are trending down a little bit on the anhydrous. Things are a little bit closer to historic averages, as well as anhydrous prices. Things are still a little bit higher than that 5-year average, and I encourage people, and I'm hopefully we're not going to be following the 2021 average here. But when we talk about setting a cash rent, negotiating some of these different things, we really need to take a look at or think more about where are input expenses at? How are they setting us up for profitability for 2024? And also, when are you pricing these inputs? Sometimes people are taking advantage and pricing when it's low. Sometimes we don't necessarily price or prepay things for the following year right here, but we end up getting up here somewhere. So have an open conversation about that. And the other common thing that we get for questions is, when is a cash rent due? I remind folks, especially if you're dealing with a beginning producer, when we're talking about setting cash rental rates and you're demanding all the cash rent upfront day one when the lease is signed, if you're someone that has a line of credit that you're having to borrow for inputs or rent or whatever the case might be, our interest rates are much higher than they've been in the last couple of years. So think about, I'm not saying you can't require a portion of the cash rent, or that you should maybe not be offering a portion of that cash rent upfront when the lease is signed, but do keep in mind that the higher interest rates we're being exposed to right now is something that's a cost that will definitely be weighing down on many operations going forward here into the future. Okay. All right. So now we went through the current state of land values, the real estate tax credit, things that we have to think about related to that. Now we'll switch gears more so onto the cash rent. We'll start at the regional level, then we'll step down to the county, and then finally down to the farm level. So a few things. When we talk about cash rents for 2024, we currently have the cash rents up here for 2023. If you're negotiating a cash rent right now, or maybe will in the next couple of months, I remind everyone that's on the call, think about, how does 2023 stack up against 2024? Are input prices just as high or higher? Are the value of what we're producing, corn, soybeans, wheat, whatever, is that similar to 2023? We have to kind of benchmark where we've been to know where we're headed in the future. So a few things that we have here, keeping in mind, this is the overall average for the region. And in addition to the overall average, we have the range up here that's called HAL. HAL stands for the average of the high grade, average of the low grade, and the overall average. What we mean by that is, let's pick on central Nebraska. The average of the high grade, or really the average of the high third, what that represents is those folks that take our survey, we ask them, can you estimate what the upper third of cash rent is in your area? And can you estimate what the lower third of cash rent is? The low third average and the high third average, okay? And what influences cash rents? Without a doubt, the quality of the land, configuration of the property. Do you have a nice square area? Do you have a field that's cut up by a ditch or a ravine? The quality of the soil. Do you have sandy soil? Is your soil very heavy, meaning very dark, like potting soil? Do you have consistent rainfall? Are you in an area that can get quite dry? All these different things pile into the cash rental rates that are paid. So keep that in mind when you negotiate or set cash rental rate when it comes to some of these different things. Okay. And another source of cash rental rates comes from the USDA. The USDA does a county level cash rent survey, and I believe they're going to be moving to an every year survey on this. The USDA has the division called NASS. NASS stands for the National Agricultural Statistics Service. And with NASS on this website right here, they published a county level map that summarizes county level cash rents. Now, I'll point a few things out. Let's talk about central Nebraska again. I say this is the cookie cutter slide, and what I mean by that is depending upon where you're at in Nebraska, the cash rents typically vary across some of these different counties. An example, maybe Custer County is closer to the low third average, and Buffalo County is maybe closer to the high third average. And in between that, we see some gradation of that. This kind of gives us some insight on how cash rents vary. Cash rents aren't exactly the same as what the University of Nebraska publishes, but they do give us some indication. There are different surveys conducted at different times during the year. That's some of the reasons we see some of these differences. If you notice your counties in white, an example here in Grant, Hooker, and Thomas counties, these counties are in an area where there's not a lot of irrigated cropland. And with that being said, or a lot of dryland cropland, they do not report an average. Same thing with here with American Hamilton. I would suspect a lot of the cropland in these two counties probably predominantly irrigated instead of dry land. You have to have enough people to return a survey that they can produce a number with confidence to estimate some of these numbers that we see up here. Okay. Let's switch gears a little bit more to irrigated. When we talk about the irrigated cash rents, they assume that the landowner owns the entire irrigation system, pivot, pump, and power unit. If the tenant provides one of those components, if the tenant provides a diesel engine to pump the water, for the example, we would discount that cash rent to reflect the contribution made by the tenant. And we'll have a slide here in the next two slides that we can, or then towards the end of our slide set today, that we can give you some tips on how to adjust some of those leases. All the things that were mentioned before about dryland, cropland regarding the quality of the property, market competitiveness of the area, are included in these cash rents. And still, even if your ground is irrigated in Nebraska, let me switch right here. Even if your ground is irrigated in Nebraska, you still need rain. And that's why we see some of the differences that we do in cash rents between the low third average in Northwest Nebraska to the high third average in Northeast Nebraska. My mistake, these are gravity irrigated rates. I wasn't paying attention in my slide header. This is for gravity irrigated rates. And these assume that the landlord owns the irrigation improvement. So if you just have a pump, for example, on irrigated ground, if the tenant would provide that component of the system, you would discount the cash rent to still account for that. And the gravity irrigated rates, traditionally, this is fairly flat land. Without a doubt, the quality of the land, rainfall, stability of the water source. Do you have seniority rights versus junior rights to water if you're on an allocation from a stream or a body of water? All those things influence cash rents. Also, the University of Nebraska reports, in addition to gravity or flood irrigated rates, the University of Nebraska also reports center pivot irrigated cropland. The center pivot rates tend to average around $30 to $50 an acre more on the center pivot than what the gravity irrigated rates do. So here on this slide, and this might be a little bit more of interest to those folks that have irrigated cropland, we have the overall average. We've seen it's generally steady, slightly higher depending on where you're at in Nebraska for 2023. And also this benchmark that we can kind of look at from the high grade to the low grade, or the high third average to the low third average. We see that there's a pretty good snapshot here on the different cash rental rates. Here in Northeast Nebraska, we go from 410 down to 155 out in the panhandle. And all those different factors of risk that we mentioned also influence the cash rental rates, rainfall, hail, whatever the case might be. And on these rates, if the tenant provides the center pivot or the power unit, you would discount the cash rent to account for the tenant providing a portion of that improvement. The USDA does not segregate or separate out. This is the 2023 rates. I'll have to fix my heading before we post these slides. These are for the 2023 year. And the USDA does not discern or discriminate between center pivot as well as gravity. Let's give an example here. Let's say in Hamilton County, which there still might be a fair amount of gravity or flood irrigation versus center pivot. the numbers reported on this slide would reflect a weighted average where you account for both the gravity or flood irrigated relative to the center pivot. So that's how we see some of these averages that we have presented here and some of the numbers that are appearing here or some of the numbers that pop up. And once again, the USDA assumes that the landowner owns the entire irrigation system. If you're in some of these areas like Platte County, for example, yes, they have irrigated cropland. If there's not enough rates reported in an area, they do not produce a number with confidence. So I would suspect for Platte County, you'd probably be looking at an average somewhat similar to some of these surrounding counties, for example. Okay, so we've talked about land values. We stepped through the cropland cash rental rates. Next, we'll step into the more on the cow-calf side, and then we'll give you some ideas on how do you actually calculate a cash rental rate. So on this slide, we have the pasture per acre rent. So when you talk about renting grazing land, you can rent by the acre, you can rent by the pair, the head, the day, the animal unit. There's probably 10 or 15 different ways you could rent. The University of Nebraska reports the per acre basis for 1 acre during this traditional 5-month grazing season. If you would be grazing from outside that period, you would adjust the cash rent to reflect for a non-traditional period. So what we have here is we have the breakdown for 2023. And in addition to that, we have the range from the 13 to 20 in the Northwest to 48 to 73 here in the East. What influences cash rental rates when it comes to grazing land? All the different things we mentioned that are intertwined with the cropland also influence grazing land. So the quality of the land, how many pairs can you put out in an area, stocking rate, are you out in the middle of nowhere? Is it an area that's fairly easy for tenants to get to? All these different things influence cash rents and the things that pile in or evaluate some of these different things. The USDA reports a per acre estimate. And once again, okay, in Adams County, which is predominantly cropland, not a lot of grazing land in that county, and that's maybe one reason they don't report an estimate there. You can see how cash rental rates vary around in some of these different regions. Generally speaking, we tend to see higher rates in the east because you can put more cow-calf pairs in a parcel of land here versus out in our major ranching areas of western Nebraska, where it takes a lot more acres to support one animal unit or one cow-calf pair or whatever the case might be. Now, switching to cow-calf pairs, this is for one cow, one calf for 1 month during the summer grazing season. If you rent in the off season, if you rent some type of unique setup, you'd maybe adjust some of these rates. But let's say, for example, here in the Southwest, where the average is about $50 a pair, if you rent for the 5-month grazing season, you would take 50 times 5, which is the per pair rate for the summer grazing season, which would be about $250. And quality of the land definitely gets reflected in some of these rates as cash rental rates, and vary significantly depending upon your area of Nebraska. Sorry, my slide advancer button keeps sticking here. Okay, now we're going to move here over to the agricultural land leases for 2024. We briefly reviewed the cash rental rates for cropland as well as grazing land. Let's talk about some of the different ways to set trends or set lease arrangements and give you some good tips on how do we account for some of these things. Okay, so here we go. First thing, there are different ways to estimate cash rental rates. I'd like to present a couple different ideas on how do we do this. First idea, when it comes to estimating cash rental rates by adjusting survey data, many folks have seen different averages that we presented on. If you're in a county that has a county level rental rate of, let's say, $190 an acre, and maybe you've seen that on the USDA map, maybe you picked that from the district information the University of Nebraska puts out. And if we know the average county corn yield is 134 bushel per acre, We know if you divide 190 divided by 134, that gives us what? That gives us the county rent per bushel. From the county rent per bushel, we take $1.42 per bushel and we slide it to the upper right-hand corner here. And we also know on this particular property, our average production yield, our APH yield, was 119 bushel per acre. If that was the case, we take what we know from the prior information on the left-hand side, $1.42 per bushel, times it by the APH yield. That gives us the adjusted farm level cash rent of $168.73 an acre. We take what we know on the left-hand side and apply it to a situation we don't potentially know. If the farm that we were going to try renting was, let's say, producing 139 bushel per acre, you would have an example here where you would step the cash rent up from 190 up a little bit higher because you're renting something that's a little bit better. Now, many folks that are trying to figure out 2024 cash rents, I think this is a good example that's called cash equivalent from crop share. And under doing the cash equivalent from crop share, let's say we are doing a crop share lease, but we are trying to make it into a cash rent. This is a good way to kind of convert it. Okay, so what I did here, let's say in this made up example, landlord gets half the yield, the tenant gets the other half. So 80 bushel goes to the landlord, 80 bushel go to the tenant. And we know under this example that we think next March, corn's going to be worth about $4.89 a bushel. It's a little less than $5. Meaning the landlord gets half the revenue and the tenant gets the other half of revenue. And in addition to that, if you are on a crop share where the landlord gets half the crop and the tenant gets the other half, meaning half of the, under a 50-50 lease, you would be describing half of the seed, fertilizer, or chemical expenses are paid by both parties involved. The difference between half of the landlord's share of the revenue minus half of the landlord's share of the crop is basically what that individual stands to make per acre. The cash equivalent from crop share, what is meant by that is if you do a cash equivalent from crop share, you can ask yourself, you know what, if I was a tenant and I was going to offer the landlord some cash rent, if I offer something around 190 to maybe 200, that would basically be a landlord would be just as well off if they would take that cash rent versus doing a crop share with me. It's a cash equivalent from share. We're asking what is the next best opportunity value on that ground given the circumstances we're operating under. So that's some of the differences on why we say cash rents where they're at in this example. Now, for those folks that maybe aren't on the crop side, but they have hay, and I don't care if this is grass hay or alfalfa hay, you can take this example and adapt it to your situation. Let's say you have some fairly good quality grass hay. And if you were doing a situation where this property produced, let's say, 1.5 tons per acre, meaning under a 1/3, 2/3 split, the landlord gets half the yield, or excuse me, a third of the yield, which would be a third of a ton per acre. And this other example, landlord gets about 3/4 of a ton per acre. Under this situation, it's grass hay that's worth quite a bit per ton. And let's say it was dry, which certain areas of our state were dry this past year. The difference between the landlord's share of the hay minus the landlord's share of expenses. And what do we notice? Under a 1/3, 2/3 split, the landlord doesn't get nearly as much of the expense or has to pay nearly as much of the expenses they do under a 50-50. Under the 50-50, let's say they sprayed that property and threw out some nitrogen fertilizer to improve that yield, and they paid $70 an acre to do that. Well, under this case, the landlord has to pick up some of that. And then in the right-hand case, they don't pick up any of it because the tenant is the one bearing all that risk. They are paying for all that input, but the landlord gets less of the crop. Under either example that was just highlighted, what I like about these is if you can plug in your own information, if you can think about how do we work through this, maybe the yield is too low, maybe the price is too high, or maybe the input expenses need to be slightly different. Use the information that is pertinent to your land. And you can use whatever example you want. I don't care if you're a landlord or a tenant or a bank or whoever might be thinking through some of these decisions. This is a good way that if you have to justify, or if somebody says, well, why are you thinking you should pay that amount? This is a good way to kind of sort through those things. Now, the final way, and this is more maybe appropriate for today's topic, just given that we're supposed to be on Ag Smart Money Week. Land is an investment, and every investment has a return. And with that being said, the rate of return typically is quite low on land. We're talking maybe in the high twos on dryland cropland, and maybe in the low 3% range for irrigated cropland. If you take the market value of the asset and multiply it by the rate of return, this gives us the rental rate per acre. So we take the market value times the rate of return. I think this might be an example you see some folks working in the finance industry maybe work through. This is just one way to kind of use what we know. And these returns are highly sensitive based on what market value you plug in here. So please be aware of that if you're thinking through some of these things. Who's responsible for maintaining the irrigation system? That was a question that was asked as part of our special features series of questions as part of the 2023 survey. And when we talk about lease provisions, what are good lease practices? Well, about half the time, the landlord and the tenant jointly help maintain the irrigation, the equipment that you have present at the site. Third of the time, the tenant takes care of it. Rest of the time, either the landlord or someone else takes care of it. Go to the next slide here. If you're in a situation where you provide the pivot, the tenant provides the pivot as part of an irrigated lease arrangement. The landlord owns the ground, they own the power unit, they own the well, but they do not own the pivot. Under that case, we'd have a situation where you would discount the cash rent to reflect the fact that the landlord is providing a major portion of that improvement, or that the tenant's providing a major portion to that property, to the improvement being the irrigation system. Under this case, about half the time you would discount the cash rent around 26 to 50 an acre, and over a third of the time you discount it 10 to 25. So please be aware you need to accurately reflect the cash rents when the tenant does provide a component of that system. And the other thing to think about is how much do we discount the cash rent per acre when the tenant provides the power unit? Three most common power units, you either have a diesel engine, propane or natural gas, or an electric motor. With that, what this slide means is, for example, 45% of the time when the tenant provides a diesel engine, you would discount the cash rents by $10 to $20 an acre. We typically see, based on our call volume here with the extension offices, it's fairly common to see 10 to 15 an acre off when the tenant provides that improvement. The tenant's responsible for maintaining it. If something got stolen or broke, they have to take care of it. They're the folks that are taking on the risk and maintaining. Same thing with pivots. Beyond the physical cost of the pivot, the other thing people tend to forget about is the insurance. How much does it cost to insure a pivot? It can be quite high. So those are some of the things that we see on what we get involved with here. Okay, just a few housekeeping things. If you do not have a lease in writing, we highly encourage everyone to get a lease in writing. A great place to find a lease is aglease101.org, aglease101.org. If you go on that website, there's a blue, kind of a blue website that comes up. If you hit Document Library, it'll bring up the next page, which has our lease publications and also our lease forms. Okay, so you have your lease publications on the left, but the actual lease forms. So as part of the discussion today on good lease practices, make sure that you take advantage of getting a lease in writing. You never know what might happen to someone, and it's always a really good thing to be keeping in mind. Leases are just not for the protection of the landlord, they are for the protection of the tenant as well. So everyone jointly knows what contract, a lease is a form of a written contract, what they are getting themselves into. One other thing with our annual survey that we do, there's a lot that it costs to send out thousands of surveys. If anyone has an interest in donating, making a small donation or monetary contribution towards it, please go to this website, go.unl.edu/land fund or the University of Nebraska Foundation and give them a call. And all donations go directly towards supporting the mailing affiliated or associated with conducting the survey. And something else that we have coming up on our list of upcoming meetings for the landlord tenant cash rents. This year's winter meeting series has a little bit of a succession twist to it. It's called So You've Inherited a Farm, So Now What? With that being said, what this is going to be looking at is we're going to be covering some of the topics we covered today. Also, regardless if you're staying to inherit or give something to someone, there's going to be some great tips in these meeting series. And we'll be updating this website, cap.unl.edu/land24 as we add more dates. I'm fairly confident we'll be adding some additional ones in Western Nebraska. And we cover in depth, in person, a lot more on some of these different things that we have up here and some of the different considerations that we need to be cognitive or aware of when it comes to a farmland lease. And finally, each business quarter, we have our webinar series called Land Management Quarterly. As part of Land Management Quarterly, we have kind of an update in this quarterly webinar. We're going to be taking a look at some updates on farm programs. That'll be a little bit different than what we covered today. And also, Alan Vanalik will be making some really good comments on landlord-tenant communication related to closing out the lease and considerations for 2024. So with that, I'll go to my last slide here if anyone would like to contact me. Let me check my Q&A plane. All right. So I had a question that came in. It said on the slide to adjust cash rents, what did the H in APH stand for? Well, let me go back to that slide since we got a few minutes. If anyone has questions, be sure to type them in and I'll take as much time as necessary to answer them. Okay, let's see here. I believe this is a slide. So in this slide here, we're taking the regional or county level information, we're applying it to the farm. APH stands for Actual Production History. It's a 10-year average that's based off our crop insurance information, our actual yields. So what your corn, soybeans, wheat yield per acre, that's kind of a benchmark or a little bit of an indication on what this property is capable of producing. So that's what APH stands for. It's actual production history. Okay. Let me check here. I think somebody else had their hand raised. If you have your hand raised, please just type it into the chat or the Q&A pane or the chat feature, and that would be the best place to input that if you would, please. And we'll just let's hang on here for another minute. I will say a few minutes we'll talk more on this. This is going to be a 3-hour workshop. When you walk in the door, we'll ask you to sign in quick, and then you get our packet of information that's provided to each and every participant. It'll include I think it's almost 135 slides. We aren't going to cover every single one, but all the slides will outline some of these different considerations and different things that have that are many things that people have asked us over the years. And this is kind of either a primer for or maybe something to reflect on if you participate in this meeting, to be thinking about that whole topic of succession, whether for a farm or a ranch. So be sure to take a look at it if you need a little bit of a primer on that. Okay, got another question that came in. As a landlord that asked a question, I provide ag sense for the center pivot. How do you consider that as part of the cash rent? I'm not quite exactly sure what ag sense is for the pivot. If I would speculate, ag sense might be some type of a device that might work with irrigation scheduling or some type of precision apparatus affiliated with it. So without knowing exactly what it is, unless I pull open Google here and look at it, providing some unique feature. When it comes to ag sense or some other unique feature to a pivot that improves the efficiency or effectiveness of it, I think that might be the safe way to say it. Does that influence the cash rent? Well, obviously, if you have an irrigation system that you can turn on with, let's say, a cell phone or a computer, might be more appealing for someone to have than just if you have to physically go out there and start the engine up or throw the power on. So the value of what we have, the value of the ground, is also incorporated in the cash rent in addition to the value of the irrigation system. How well is it maintained? How much upkeep is it? Things of that nature. Okay, and somebody responded in our Q&A. It is for irrigation. You can control from the pivot in your phone. With AgSense, it's one of these precision apparatuses on how do we apply water, and there's some very unique options out there in the industry available for that. All right, another question on APH. How long does it take to establish and how often is it updated? So remember, we said before, APH stands for Actual Production History. It's a 10-year average. Now, if you're a beginning producer and you don't have that yield history, you don't have 10 years of yield history, there are different things that can be done. There are some plug yields, some county level plug yields where they give you like a historic county average and then you start plugging in your own information. Or if you're working with an established operation, there might be some ways that they can share. An example, if you have an operator that has a child that wants to farm with them, the operator might be able to give or share their APH history with someone else to let them get started. Okay. All right, with that, I don't see any other questions coming in. Be sure check out Land Management Quarterly if you haven't ever attended one. It's a great thing that we give some tips. It's only an hour long. We got 2 different speakers. And it's on my list of slides. I got to get updated yet, but we got some really good information coming out on that, especially related to the ARC and PLC farm programs. And be sure to join us if you can. So with that, Shannon, do you have any closing comments you'd like to make?
No. Just thank you everyone for joining us today. A recording of this webinar will be posted on the cap.unl.edu website. And you can also register for other upcoming webinars. We have a lot of great stuff going on this week with Ag Smart Money Week. And we would also really appreciate your feedback on the brief evaluation that should pop up, I believe, as you close out the Zoom, or else you'll receive it shortly after, because that kind of helps inform us of what you want to see in the future. And thank you again for joining us.